Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Physical punishment of our child. Is it tough love or is it abuse? Now, this is a conversation that creates a huge chasm between so many people. Physical or corporal punishment by a parent or other legal guardian is an act causing deliberate physical pain or discomfort to a minor child in response to some undesired behaviour. It typically takes the form of smacking or slapping a child with an open hand or striking with an implement such as a belt, slipper, cane or hairbrush, and can also include shaking, pinching, forced ingestion of substances, or forcing children to stay in uncomfortable positions. Now, years ago, physical punishment of children was generally accepted worldwide. It was considered an appropriate method of eliciting behavioural compliance that was conceptually distinct from physical abuse. Now, I was part of that era. We were given the cane at school if we didn't behave, and teachers could smack us if inclined. A friend of mine was constantly beaten by a teacher through his years in a Catholic college because the teacher just disliked him. In 2020, this teacher was put in jail for his part in beating students and sexual abuse of those in his care. Our parents accepted this if it came from people that they looked on as pillars of society. For example, teachers, priests, policemen. At home, it was totally acceptable to hit your child for any misbehaviours. Children often appeared at school with marks on their legs and shoulders from where they'd been hit. I had a friend who lived in fear of not getting home in time to finish peeling the family of eight's potatoes for dinner before her mum got home. She would get smacked around the legs if this was not so. I remember being so grateful for my parents, who might have threatened physical punishment, but I have no living memory of receiving it. However, this perspective began to change as studies found links between normative physical punishment and child aggression, delinquency, and spousal assault in later life. Some of these initial studies involved large representative samples from the United States. Some studies controlled the potential confounders, such as parental stress and socioeconomic status. Other studies examined the potential of parenting reasoning to moderate the association between physical punishment and child aggression. Virtually without exception, these studies found that physical punishment was associated with higher levels of aggression against parents, siblings, peers, and spouses. Sweden outlawed all corporal punishment for children in 1979. An increasing number of countries have enacted similar bans, particularly following the international adoption of the Convention on Rights of the Child. However, only 63 nations from a total of 196 currently ban all forms of corporal punishment, including that in the home. Around the world, 4 in every 5 children aged between 2 and 14 years old are subject to corporal punishment in homes, schools, and childcare settings, while 86% of children worldwide are not yet protected by legislation prohibiting against corporal punishment. In Geneva on the 28th of April 2023, the International Day to End Corporal Punishment was called for the elimination of all forms of corporal punishment by 2030 universally, in order to meet the targets of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals agreed upon in 2015. The debate around corporal punishment of children is a very personal thing. There's no judgment in this podcast of how people discipline their children. Understanding that everyone has different opinions, experiences, and different values around physical punishment. Today we're going to be talking to Professor Sophie Havighurst about the recent research and data on physical punishment on children and the effects it has on children's lives, and whether there are better alternatives to physical punishment to help discipline our children successfully. Professor Havighurst is a child clinical psychologist and leader in Tuning Into Kids research and dissemination. She's a co-author of the original Tuning Into Kids parenting program with Anne Harley. Professor Havighurst does not seek any consequences for those who use physical punishment on their children, but wants the current laws in Australia to change. I'm Kate Mason. Welcome to Parenting and Personalities. This is the podcast that connects you with the ones you care about the most. Good morning, Sophie. It's lovely to have you here with me.
Lovely to be here, Kate.
Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to start today's discussion with the question, why do parents smack their children?
Well, that's a really good question. I think often it happens out of anger, parents' anger. Mm-hmm. So there might be an element of which it is, I'm going to discipline my child, but often spanking, smacking, physical punishment happens when we are in an intense moment of anger at our child for what they've just done. It's really interesting. I think there's a sort of dual part of that. Why would we hit when we're angry? But probably it's just part of that fight, flight, or freeze response. It's the fight response to anger.
Right.
And with the idea, I guess, that many people say, well, I'm spanking my child, I'm smacking my child, I'm washing them mouth out with soap to try and teach them a lesson and stop them doing that behaviour again. So that, I guess, is an intention that we've learned, that getting angry and hitting or physical punishment equals that outcome to change child behaviour.
So is spanking effective? What has been proven around spanking or smacking?
Well, it's very interesting because actually to smack or hit will often immediately stop a child doing what they're doing. So you can get immediate compliance, which makes parents and carers often think, oh, that worked. But there are a large number of studies now that show that while you might get immediate compliance, it does a number of things. It tends to break down that connection with your between parent and child. It tends to increase negative feelings within the child that often will come out later as more aggressive, angry behaviour. It tends to lower a child's self-esteem. I don't feel so good about myself. I'm a bad person. So that is internalised. And we know that over time it leads to an increase in anxiety and depression, in aggressiveness, in relationships. It depends on your personality, your gender, various other things, but you might internalize it and lead it to lowering your self-esteem and more, I feel awful about myself, or I act out and I'm more aggressive. So those are the sort of short but also medium-term consequences. Also longer term, we know that, and this is really interesting, the Australian child maltreatment study that's just come out with 3,000 people from around Australia found that being hit 4 or more times in childhood doubles your risk for anxiety and depression. So that's not physical abuse. We're talking about that smack on the bum. Mm-hmm. 4 or more times, it doubles your chance of having anxiety and depression. And also it teaches a child that I love you and I hit you. And obviously that sets up a very important intimate relationship dynamic that can have long-term consequences. So we know that it does lead to and increases your risk for being violent in an intimate domestic relationship or being on the receiving end of that as an adult.
That's huge. So is there a generational component to this? Because I've been talking, I'm in my early 60s, and I've been talking to my age group around this, and I know that you have noted this before in conversation, is that our generation sit there and say, well, it was good for me and I'm okay, it hasn't harmed me, so there's nothing wrong with it. And they look at the discipline that's occurring these days and the society that's possibly more out of hand than then, and their justification is it's okay. And I sit back and I'm trying to be as on a par so that I'm not creating an argument. But it's an extremely controversial subject. Yeah. And I haven't actually spoken to the younger generation around it. I've got a 28-year-old and a 30-year-old, and they have not had physical punishment during their upbringing. So, I'm hoping that reflects and follows through. But I'll be interested to know, are the younger demographic less around that type of thing?
Absolutely. And interestingly, the Australian Child Maltreatment Study actually found that in the 65-year-olds and over, about 38% approved of using physical punishment. But the younger cohort, the 16 to 24-year-olds, only 15% thought it was okay to smack. So there are big differences between those beliefs. But what you're raising here is it's really interesting points, because I think there are generational differences. And also I think it's really important to think, well, yes, many of us have experienced or been on the receiving end of smacking, and we might not think that has harmed or hurt us, and it might not have, or how would we know actually if it had or not, really? Also, I don't know, Kay, about you, but when I was growing up, and as someone in my early 50s, I was growing up driving in the car with my mum and dad smoking cigarettes. We didn't have car seats. We didn't have seatbelts in the back. And those things we found out are actually really bad for children.
Yes.
So we do find things out over time, and then our laws change and we go, okay, it's illegal now to smoke in a car with an under 16-year-old. It is illegal not to have a child in a car seat or in a seatbelt. So we've changed the law because we found out that children have bad outcomes, or can have bad outcomes. But I didn't die. I haven't got lung cancer from what I know of at this point.
Yes.
So nothing bad has happened to me from my parents doing those things growing up. But we learn these things and we find out new information. We go, okay, we need to change what we do here. And that's really important, because I think it allows us to understand that what's been done to us in the past, we can make changes. And it doesn't mean what we've had done to us or what we might have done to our own children if we've smacked our children. It doesn't mean we can't learn, okay, there's something different to do here. We're learning this is bad for kids. It has a whole range of different negative outcomes, or can do, on children. We can make those changes as a result.
That's a great picture to paint, because I think too it stops the blame or whatever guilt that might be there in that parenting issue once this comes up into the media as such as well, sitting there thinking, well, because yes, I came from the era of the cane at school, and children got hit when they got home if they hadn't done jobs, and a lot of it was very, very common. And in my lead-in story, I note, about someone who was recently put in prison for beating one of our friends up at school, so you have all of that, and it was acceptable because no one knew any different. So it's really great.
Yeah. And look, I think, as you say, schools have made the changes. Most schools, most states and territories in Australia, for example, have legislated against using the cane in schools. And essentially, I was having a conversation with my father, who was a teacher, and he, in teaching in New Zealand, he talked about trying to change his school from stopping using the cane, and how up in arms all the teachers were and people within the community about stopping caning. But now it's completely accepted. So we can change what we do. We can make things no longer a practice, and we can go, okay, that was what happened in the past, but we are doing something different. I think that's really important, because I think otherwise we end up feeling shame, guilt, and anger if we feel like we're being told we're a bad person. That's not the case. We're finding new information out, and we do things differently as we progress.
Yeah.
But also, Kate, one of the other things I think that comes up is people fear that by stopping using physical punishment, they're letting kids get away with things. And that's actually something that really comes up, because not using physical, as I was saying earlier, physical punishment doesn't equal improved behaviour. It might be compliant in the moment, but then it usually leads to more difficulties over time.
Mm-hmm.
That we have to do something else. So we've still got to have boundaries around kids' behaviour, because children do need to know that is right and that is wrong. When you do that, you've got to address that. You've got to repair that. You've got to fix that. You've got to apologise, whatever those things are. It's really important. So I think people fear that we're going to end up with kids without any limits, boundaryless, out of control. And that can happen if you take away any form of discipline. You still need a form of discipline or guiding children about in the right way to behave.
Hey, parenting's a tough gig. There are no rule books, just you and any well-meant advice, books that don't always hit the mark, and, well, maybe your well-meaning mother-in-law telling you what to do. No one knows your kid or you. Contact me and we'll find out how you can connect to your most important treasure. thepersonalitycoach.com.au. So that's very true. And I think, though, also that therefore the people who are in their 60s do see today's children as lacking in discipline. The discipline styles have changed, and I think there's a certain level where it was let loose and people weren't reinforcing stuff enough. Do you think that's also a generational thing? Because for me, that was almost my parenting. The earlier years where no one's a winner, everyone's gets a prize type of scenario that's gone through, and I'm preaching to my children. You've got to have boundaries. You talk to the feelings, but there's got to be boundaries all around this kind of area. So has a certain generation almost missed out on a certain amount of discipline, do you think? Or am I just looking at that very generally? I don't know.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I think we get that pendulum swing where it moves from lots of discipline and force to keep the boundaries to switching to no boundaries, and we do need to bring it back to some boundaries, and the boundaries need to be set in a way that is respectful and doesn't use harm and violence or even coercion and threat, because I think you can threaten a child in a way that doesn't use physical punishment, but it still has an effect on a child that they're always threatened with something happening if they don't. And I don't know if that's the right way we want to go either. And again, that often happens when we're angry. And that's why so often you need to step back, from the anger.
So therefore, how do people find a better way of doing things? What are the better alternatives these days so that you can bring in the discipline, you can leave out the anger, and you can leave out the violent, the punishment factor of something? What are your best ways of helping people find a better way of disciplining,
So the things that I think really important are, first off, in the moment when something happens with a child, you do often need to say that's what the limit is. Kids got to know why you're stopping a screen or you're taking them into another room. So you have to do that, but you don't want to do that more than just once briefly. Also, often you're angry at that time. So one of the things you want to be able to do is, if I'm actually really angry, I might just need to breathe 3 times slowly, stand up and move around, have a drink of water, step out. If I come in the heat of anger and try and discipline my child, all I'm doing is I'm using anger to make them more intimidated, threatened, hurt. It's not teaching them. So I've got to actually manage my own anger in that moment. Also, when a child is very angry, they don't take anything in because we know that the brain is on that fight, flight, or freeze response. They're not using their rational part of their brain, the thinking part of the brain that goes, actually, yeah, she does have a point, or maybe I could have actually let her borrow that first, or so the rational brain's not working. A child needs to be calmer before they can then talk about what can we do here. So breathing time, letting off steam time, having some time just to settle a bit. And then when you as a parent are calmer and the child is calmer, you might come back and say and use empathy about their feelings, but still be able to talk to them about their behaviour. Separating those two things out is important. I can be angry with my sister for taking something away from me. I can be angry about you taking away their iPad from me. I can feel resentment about that. I can feel hurt by what you've just said. Those are my feelings. So you want a parent to be able to actually name those feelings and empathize with those. That's really hard when your sister does that. I know that's really difficult. Yep. And then to give a little bit of space so the child knows that you've actually heard how they felt and validated that it's okay to feel that way. And then you might get to the point where you settle a bit, you connect around that, you might have a hug, and then you might sort of say to them, I wonder what you could do next time. Or if something's been broken, hurt, someone's been hurt, you might need to say, I wonder what we could do to make this a bit better right now. And the kid might say, no, and then they're still quite angry, so it's not quite the time to solve a problem. But you might be able to say, I wonder what you could do with your sister, knowing that you hurt her quite a lot before. I don't know. What normally works and so you might troubleshoot what could that child do, because it's really important for a child to address what they've done and repair what they've done and to learn that. But they can't do that through you making them do it. Forcing apologies is a terrible way of getting a child to learn about correcting what they've done and addressing what they've done. You want them to actually be able to come to it eventually and say, I'm sorry, coming from that genuine, but often it doesn't happen. It takes a while. Kids feel ashamed, guilty, all sorts of feelings that they just can't face that. It does take them a while.
So as a parent, you have to diffuse yourself first almost. Yep. So that's really, really important. And I can see that's a really great way of putting it and working it out with your child. And like you say, sometimes they really don't care. They're just apologising for the sake of apologising, and, they move on. And my kids will say to me as adults, well, I didn't really feel sorry about that. That wasn't, No. So you just do it the best way that can be done at the time. But they're great alternatives for looking at that. Now, currently there's a lot of media in Australia around your passion that you have around this subject. Would you like to tell us what's going on, what paper you've released, and also what is currently in place in Australia and what you're aiming for?
So as part of the Parent and Family Research Alliance, we're a group of leading parenting researchers in Australia. And we've all come together and written a paper about what's the current state of the evidence on using corporal punishment with children in order for us to advocate for changing the law. So we've written this paper, which was released yesterday in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Public Health. And it did attract a huge amount of media attention because it's a very interesting and topical issue that raises lots of emotions for people, yes. Lots of reactions. It really polarizes people. Sure, children should have the right to be free from violence like anyone else, like an adult, like a dog, like my neighbour. Mm. So people feel passionately that way and people feel passionately the other way. So that brings up lots of different feelings about this. As part of a wider group, we're involved in a campaign around ending physical punishment of Australian children, EPAC. And a group along with myself, Daryl Higgins, who's a professor at Australian Catholic University, and Karen Flanagan from Save the Children. We are leading a group of, I think we've got maybe 110 different people who are lawyers, politicians, children's commissioners, academics, practitioners, lots of different people who are all coming together going, we've got to do something here. So this paper is in some ways our beginning of saying, this is where Australia's at. We've looked at other countries. We've gone, what happened in New Zealand when they made this change? Because New Zealand is, kind of similar to Australia in attitudes and have a history of convict history. They have, immigration, a lot of the tough sort of history there. And in 2007, they made the change to making it no longer legal in Australia, in New Zealand, to use corporal punishment. That came with 20 years of lead up of advocacy by people in New Zealand to get to that position. Okay. Since they've done that, there has been a significant reduction in attitudes to using corporal punishment. So in our journal paper, we actually review that in New Zealand, it was about 58% of people thought corporal punishment was okay in 2007. And now it's only about 19% of people in New Zealand think it's okay. So they had a big change when they changed the law. But they also did a really big public health campaign to let people know it's not okay to hit your child. There are alternatives. Hitting your child has damaging effects. And Wales has just had a beautiful campaign on this too because they've just made it illegal too. So you need a big public health campaign, and then you need to have lots of options. What else do I do if I can't hit my child to control their behaviour? What else do I do? So we need options of parenting education, finding out alternatives. And currently in Australia, there is a big move around making parenting education much more widely, freely available. Triple P is available as a universal option for parenting in Australia. Tuning Into Kids, the program I'm involved in, is available. Lots of other good parenting programs are becoming more widely available as alternatives to hitting. So those are things we need. We need law change, we need a public health campaign, and we need access to other parenting options for what to do instead. So our group are really working on this, and Daryl and Karen and myself, along with the team, are really wanting to push this. So we are now moving to calling on our states and territories, because it has to happen in the state. Each state and territory has to change their law, their criminal code or criminal act, to make it illegal. It's not a federal decision.
And they all have
We
different
do,
ones
yeah.
currently, don't they?
So I'm in Victoria, and we're working hard here and calling on the Premier and others, the Attorney General, to actually make this change in law in Victoria. And that's where we're at right now. So we think it's really important. This is part of increasing public awareness of this issue. We can make these changes. We've done it in lots of other areas of children's health and well-being. And currently the pushback from government is that that government shouldn't be involved in private family matters. But, we do a lot of being involved in private family matters. As I said before, we're not allowed to smoke in a car with a child. We're not allowed to have our child without a seatbelt on. There are plenty of examples where government legislate to ensure that private family matters can be regulated.
Is there government legislation around hitting your wife or hitting a partner?
Oh, there is.
Not? Okay, cool. And
it's called assault.
Yes,
and that's right. And Kate, if you hit my child, I can charge you with assault. But if I hit my child, I'm not. It's actually legitimate discipline.
So there's quite a contradiction in that sense.
It's quite a contradiction. And the UN has called on Australia for, a couple of decades now, saying you are well behind, you need to act. Children have the right to live a life free from violence like everyone else in society. It's very important.
What I've noticed about the nations that are involved is that America's not, is it? Hasn't yet.
America hasn't. No, that's right.
No, Canada.
That's right.
Australia.
So Canada is on the brink of legal change. That it's currently sitting in the Senate. It's being debated, the bill to actually change the law. So they're right on the brink as well.
Cool.
We've got to be there. Australia needs to be there.
We do. And thank you so much for bringing this matter to light, because I think it is so important and not many people actually know about it. And there are people out there on the fence, and either side of the fence, of course, as you're saying, it's very different. But if you look at the story behind the changes that have happened with things that are really bad for us, which are really important, such as the smoking and the seatbelts, which have saved many lives. I think it's really a really great look at the whole issue itself, and we're really lucky to have people like you advocating for this in Australia, and hopefully there'll be a lot of support out there for you moving forward. Thank you so much for being on today, Sophie.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
In the words of Steve Miller, Global Child Protection Director, Save the Children International, said, "Children around the world have a right to legal protection from corporal punishment in the family home and all other settings of their lives. This human right is recognised under international treaties, including the Convention on All Rights of the Child. Yet many countries fail to prohibit corporal punishment. All countries must respect children's rights and ban all forms of corporal punishment." Thank you for listening to Parenting and Personalities. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you leave a rating and a review that would help others learn about this podcast. If you're interested in discovering more about you and your family's personality types, you'll find my book, Who Is This Monster or Treasure in My House, on Booktopia or Amazon. If you have an episode idea, please send a note to thepersonalitycoach@gmail.com. Many thanks to our producers at Stories and Strategies, and we'll see you next time.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.